Let me just start this off. Sweet. So I'm Mojmir. I work as a principal developer at Silverstripe. I'm based in Auckland, New Zealand, just chilling in the Auckland office of Silverstripe. I'm an open source contributor, so you can find me collaborating on different open source modules. I'm also a maintainer of the Fluent module, which provides localization capability for Silverstripe framework. We will talk more about this module later. But we have a lot of topics to cover today, so let's ease into it by talking about preferences. For example, this is how I prefer my meal to be served. So it's nice, self-contained, no extra seasonings needed. You just grab a spoon and dig in. And this is how my wife prefers to have her meal served. So quite the difference, isn't it? What happens if I'm presented with a meal organized in this way? So I would be completely lost. I don't even know which part am I supposed to eat. And definitely I can't even name individual dishes. You can help me by providing translation for individual dishes. This is a huge improvement, but unfortunately it's not quite enough. You see, the problem is that even if I understand what individual dishes are, they are organized in a very inconvenient way for me. So this is what I'm going to do. I found cooked fish, rice, and nice smelling sauce. So let's group that together and just call it a main. And then I found two meals which resemble soup. So that will be our next group. Sweet things can go together as a dessert. And things that are still moving will end up in a too fresh group, and I'll stay away from that. Now things are organized in a way I find convenient, so I'm ready to enjoy the meal. So let's just review what has just happened in more detail. So what we've done is we provided translation for individual dishes and also provided a new structure which matches the desired preference more compared to what was the original structure. We all have preferences, but if we zoom out a little bit, you could find a lot of people in Europe with similar preferences for this particular example. These preferences are usually influenced by the place we grew up in, as the culture around us has an impact. We can describe the process as translation and restructure, but the restructure term is actually a bit generic. So instead, I like to use word culturalization, which means restructure of content to fit cultural needs of a specific audience. And finally, this is the main formula which we will talk about for pretty much the rest of the presentation, but in the context of website content, not delicious meals. So localization design is a process that should run before the implementation phase of localization of your website. It covers analysis of your current state, so it can be existing project which is getting localization or a new project basically starting from scratch. And we need to think about how to get to the desired state, like, because there are many ways how to tackle localization. Suppose the localization needs to be introduced into an existing project or a new project. What are the things we should check before localization process can even start? So accessibility check is something that's highly recommended before you can localize your website. Accessible websites make the localization easier as the content is more structured and compatible with localization requirements. Content-related issues are surfaced early and can be actioned separately from localization. This is an example from a Japanese website. The navigation component, as you see here, the button, is actually just an image. It's not really like an accessible text. So when you get to localizing this component, you will actually find out like, oh, actually this is an image, and we need to update it to text, and only then we can actually localize it. So it's easier to find this out early during accessibility check. Accessibility also provides some level of automatic translation capability, as browsers these days provide functional translation out of the box. I wouldn't recommend it though. It's just a really like basic baseline. Yeah, so you can basically do something like this, but I don't think you will reach a lot of potential audience. We can now talk about the first part of the localization formula, which is translation. I'm going to showcase the use of Silverstripe Fluent module, which is a localization solution, but it's obviously not the only solution. But we find it's quite convenient, and it covers quite a lot of variety of needs. The module has quite a few configuration options, though. So you need to, like, the challenge is to figure out what best suits your project. So we'll explore this one localization challenge at a time. So basically, I will kind of describe the challenge or the topic, and then I will try to explain how Fluent module helps you to deal with that particular problem. So translation plan is a good place to start. So there are several considerations like project size, which obviously drives the amount of translatable content, and also available budget and delivery timeline. Also, you have to consider dependencies on third parties, such as translation agencies, because it depends on the amount of content, but it may take a while to get all your stuff translated. So how does Fluent module help with translation plan? First, we need to discuss the concept of localization tree, because it's quite like a fundamental block that Fluent module relies on. Localization tree represents the relationship between locales on your project. You can view this as a tree-like structure, which forms like a hierarchy of locales. Configuration of this tree directs the Fluent module when presenting localized content to the website visitor. So, for example, if a website visitor visits a page within the German locale, the content served will be coming from German locale in case such content is available. Otherwise, it will fall back to the English locale. So that's what happens in this particular example. Let's get back to our translation plan and start with a very simple example. So we'll have a really small project size. It can be a small brochure site with only dozens of pages that we need to translate, and we can get all translations out because we can get the translations ahead of time. So the content can be pre-populated in a CMS, and then we can just publish all the pages at once because it's just a handful of pages. So how does our localization tree look like for this particular example? As you can see, it's not really a tree. It's quite simple. So these types of rules will direct Fluent module to not serve any content for pages in the German locale unless there is localized content for that German locale. So there is no fallback to English locale because basically we expect all the pages to have a localized version for the German locale. Let's have a look at another example. So we need to, in this case, we will need to translate a large travel site with lots of content. So it's probably unreasonable to ask a translation agency to do that all up front, especially when there is some content authoring happening. So the content is changing; it's not static. So probably the most suitable plan is to translate the content through small increments. So translated pages will become available in small numbers as we go. So basically, it will be like small groups appearing in the new locale over a long period of time. So how does our localization tree look like for this particular example? You can see it's a bit more complicated compared to the previous example. So we expect the majority of localized content to not be available at the time of the kind of rollout. So we need to configure the fallback rules for locales. As you can see, the website visitor accessing page in German locale will be served German content if available, but if it's not available, it will fall back to UK English locale. And finally, if that is not available, it will fall back to the international English content. So how is this managed in the CMS? So localization tree is managed through CMS model admin under the locale section. So you can just find your locale record and basically set up fallbacks for it. So unfortunately, there is no capability of Fluent module to kind of like draw out the localization tree. It's just managed, and you have to kind of like imagine it, I guess. But it's very, very simple to set it up. So as a general rule, it's very easy to implement configuration change within the Fluent module, but finding the most suitable configuration like that may be challenging. So I recommend like taking your time, like figuring that out. So localization design is the process that is trying to tackle this challenge. Some projects may find it difficult to fit into this concept of localization tree because it's kind of like a global rule, and some projects will require some more refined rules, maybe some exceptions or something like more specific. So let's consider the following localization tree. So not too complicated, but not completely simple. So we have a German locale falling back on the English locale, and then we have a Japanese locale sitting on the side because by the nature of kind of like Japanese audience needs is quite different from English or German. So we need to keep it separate. So for this particular project, we have a requirement that we need different localization rules, which are modal level specific. So that means in this particular example, let's say campaign pages have to serve content only for the specific locale. So we want to avoid any fallback rules. So this is quite a common requirement because campaign pages are usually related to campaigns, which are kind of, you can see it as an event that is specifically crafted for a very narrow audience. So it kind of does make sense to make it available to broader audience. Next, we have assets. So for assets, we actually want to allow fallback to any locale. So this is because assets, like they do have some metadata, which is translatable content, but in the end, like some projects will care just about the file binary, so basically the image itself, and maybe the localization can just avoid following any rules. You can just like, if it's available if at least one locale, we can just make it available for any locale. And finally, for block pages, we just want to retain the global rules, so essentially just following the localization tree. So all of this is possible to set up in Fluent. You can have modal level configuration. So here are two settings that you can set up. So they essentially do the same, just the first one is impacting website visitor, and the second one is impacting content author. So basically it's CMS and front end. So we have three options that you can set into these two configurations. So you can have any, which means that any fallback is used. So essentially that will be used for our assets. So as long as the content exists in a single locale, then we can just allow falling back to the locale, even though there is no fallback rule in our localization tree. The second value is fallback. That's the default behavior. So just follow the localization tree. And the third one is exact. So this will be used for our campaign pages. So it will ignore fallbacks even if they are configured. So it has to be localized in specific locale. So let's have a look at the localization tree and how this configuration impacts the tree. So if we have a look at assets, so we configured any option for the configuration. So we can see the content will go through German locale first, fall back to English, And even though there is no fallback rule in the tree, if the asset is available in Japanese locale, it will be served for the German page. Let's have a look at the campaign pages now. So these have the exact option set. So in this case, the localization tree has the fallback rule from German locale to English one, but it will not be followed. So campaign page will be only available for the German locale if it's configured like that. All right, so now it's time to talk about the second part, which is the culturalization. Second part of the formula, quite important too. So there are a lot of existing conventions on placement of certain components, such as main navigation. As we can see on the image there, like similar components can be placed in various parts of the website and can be, like the way it's presented can be quite different. Another example would be very simple, some modal dialog, which is just presenting some information and OK and cancel buttons. So you can do it in different ways. So some of these conventions can be data driven. So you can actually like collect data and make your case that this is the optimal way how to place components on your website. But some of these placements can be caused by preference of the audience, like what people are familiar with or comfortable with. So we can explore that a bit further, like what influence can be present, like in particular audience, and what is their expectation of like structure and placement of UI components. So one strong influence is actually native language. So obviously we live in quite a global world, so you can go pretty far with English, but we have still many other languages, and even people who are bilingual, like the native language still has a lot of influence. So for English, you can see on the picture on the left that we have like certain flow how we read things. So that one is general top-down flow, and within the single line we go left to right, and the star represents the starting point. But for Japanese language, you would go right to left as a general direction, and within the single line you would go top down, which is quite different. This kind of impacts how people consume information. So preferences and expectation of your audience are important consideration when it comes to the localization design. Website visitors are more likely to appreciate your website if the structure makes sense to them. So it's a really important consideration. How can we manage different structures via the Fluent module? So this is quite a challenging problem, because this is like a new level of translation, right? Because before we just kind of mapped components one-to-one, but now we actually want to consider a different structure. So one of the examples of localized structure is a different set of content blocks for different locales. You can see the example that's an English page and has a set of blocks there. And example on the right shows the same page localized in Japanese locale, containing different set of blocks, but you can see like two blocks may be the same. They are just placed in different parts of the page. So instead of localizing individual blocks and having the same page structure, you localize the structure itself. So how does this look like in terms of Fluent configuration? We actually can localize the relationship instead of content. So by default, Fluent module will only localize like content, like fields and so on, but it will avoid localizing relationships, like relationship IDs. So you have to specifically configure Fluent to do this, and you can do this through the translation property. And in this particular example, we will assume that the blocks are provided by the Silverstripe elemental module. It's quite a common solution for content blocks. And then we need to direct Fluent to create a localized copy of the blocks when localizing a page. So after these two changes, we're kind of done. And when content author in the CMS localizes the page, so basically you can have an English page and you localize it to Japanese page, you will have a duplicate set of blocks. So it's a different set, and you can just edit those in the Japanese locale, and they are kind of living now separate. So you can make any changes without influencing the English page. So we focused mostly on website visitor experience, but don't forget about your content authors. So those are the people who are populating your site content, and you also want to basically reserve some attention for them. So Fluent module provides some flexibility when it comes to CMS UI, as various components can be enabled or disabled. So that gives you kind of the flexibility to tweak the UI for your specific needs. For example, the edit form localize action buttons can be disabled. At the same time, this can be because this can be achieved through localization manager as well. So here's an example of the action buttons. So it's basically so there's a picture on the top. So that's like a much simpler UI, just two actions. But if you want to give your content authors more control, you can see the localization manager on the bottom. So you have like much more information available there. You can publish pages in different locales through that. So it's more complex but more powerful tool. Localization manager can also be configured to show only certain actions. So the picture shows kind of like all the actions available, but you can narrow it down. So it's quite flexible. So for example, you can allow only copy to a locale and just disallow copy from locale. There is also localization toolbar available. So these are quite handy actions. You can, for example, publish a page in all locales at once, but also you can unpublish and archive the page in all locales. So these actions can be quite dangerous. So it's kind of up to you to decide if you let your content authors use them or not. So every project has different needs, and the content author requirements will be quite different. So the general recommendation is to explore and document the expected content author journey for your specific project, and basically narrow down the requirements to specific actions that you need, and basically disable everything else, because Fluent by default comes with like most of this stuff enabled. So it's probably maybe like too complex. So you don't want to like confuse your content authors. They just need the UI they need for their work. And speaking of restricting access, Fluent comes with a local level permission settings. So you can set up permissions per locale, but there is also a special permission to allow access to all locales. So you can see on the picture, like basically you would set up a user group, and then you have this localization section, and you can just tick whatever locales should be available. And on the bottom, there is a special permission to allow basically all locales. So this special permission is required for some of these actions. For example, save the page in all locales. Sweet. So this covers the basics of localizing your project in Fluent. So this covers just very, very fundamental parts and concepts. And I think I still have time for a bonus topic. So I will spend some time on that. But first, let's just summarize the basics. So basically, step one, take your time and discover your localization needs for your particular project. Step two is configure the Fluent to cater to the needs of the website visitor. Like that's probably the most important thing. But also step three is don't forget about your content authors. There are many ways how you can configure Fluent to be managed in the CMS, and some of these options are better than others. If it's not configured optimally for your project, content authors may be doing some additional work, which is not great. So Fluent comes with a pretty good default setup out of the box, but it's still important to review it, like if all things are kind of relevant for your project. Fluent module is pretty well documented, so I recommend to check out the docs. So there is the link there. So you have your installation notes, but also like how-tos. There are some like very common scenarios, example setups. There are some more technical docs because your developers will be interested to know, for example, how to write unit tests with localized fixtures and so on. That's like a additional complexity they have to deal with. So that's all documented and available to you. All right, I think we have time for a bonus part, so I'll just go. I think I just need a few more minutes for that. So let's talk about routing with Fluent. So each locale needs to have a URL segment specified, so you can set it up through CMS modal admin. So the locale section, you just navigate to your locale edit form, and you can see on the bottom of the picture there is the URL segment. Also, you need to mark at least one of your locales as a default locale for the Fluent to work optimally. And the locale URL segment will impact how the URLs of your content pages look like in various locales. So the locale URL segment is the first one after like the base URL. So in this example, you can see there is the international English URL. So basically the last part is /int. And there is one for German local as well, that's /de. Fluent provides some configuration options for routing, so you can choose to skip the locale URL segment for the default locale. So for example, in this case, the first URL is showing like you can have the international locale represented there. So there is the int URL segment. But if you make international locale the default locale and you configure the Fluent to skip this URL segment, you can have it without the int. So this is really handy when you're adding Fluent to existing projects. So you basically you have your URL structure already set. You basically, I don't know, you have search engines looking at that, so you don't want to change that. So you can say my existing URL structure will become the same as for the default locale. All right, and that's it. So we can move to the questions segment. So I can stop sharing. Let's see Q&A. So there's a question here. Why is the representation of the original text content fallback not being preserved when fields are marked translatable afterwards? This makes the process of translation large existing projects confusing. So I think the translation, the way you configure the translatable fields is basically module level, and then the fallbacks is like a global setting. So essentially, I'm not really sure. Like, I think I would need a specific example for this one. Like, what exactly is the problem there?
Stream as well. So if you could probably post an example to follow up to your question, we can look into that later.
I think also what happens is, we've had it before too, that once you add Fluent to a data object later, then you have to go through the CMS and save everything as a locale when you add it to it later. So that's probably what he's or she is asking. If you have an existing project and you add Fluent to it, then you have to, then the language that you've already saved as a default is not added to the Fluent data tables yet.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So actually, with the Fluent 6, there is now a migration dev task. So essentially, if you have this particular case, you can run the dev task, and it will basically publish or localize and publish your content in the default locale. So, but that's just in Fluent 6, I think. So hopefully that kind of solves the problem.
No, I've run into that before, so good to know that there's a dev task for that.
Yeah,
Yep,
Thank you.
no worries.
that's great. I actually have one question. Do you have any preferred solution for localized configurations, or something that you would like to configure in your YAML files, but you need some different values for each locale, maybe the contact email address for different departments in different countries?
Yeah, so actually one of the projects that I worked on had similar requirement, and you can use the locale module to save these. So essentially you can add an extension to add new fields to the locale module and basically add those fields there. So the particular example that I'm talking about is, for example, you can have search engine keys in different locales. So you would just store that directly on the locale module.
You will solve it in the backend, in site config, and not in the YAML configuration.
Yeah, so it would be
files.
basically the data would be stored in database as opposed to YAML.
Thank you.
No worries.
Any more questions?
Are you all using Fluent? Okay.
Pardon?
Yeah. Are you happy with it?
So basically, I
You don't know
worked
about
on.
this task
Yeah.
to migrate.
No, that's a good one.
So keep asking questions. Maybe we find out more things you don't know about it.
Yeah, I think Fluent's almost a requirement for European companies to use, and it's hard to not have an international site. You have to have it. Any more questions from anybody? Anybody curious about anything about Fluent?
No.
How do you keep an overview, like once you have a complex translation tree and maybe some special rules for individual pages or content blocks and so on, how do you make sure that it doesn't end up in total chaos, like for content editor to understand why which local is served and where he needs to change or she needs to change stuff?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so my recommendation is document your localization requirements. And once you implement your Fluent solution, just keep your documentation up to date. So in one particular project, for example, we have like a Confluence page, and that kind of captures the localization tree, the special examples like the campaign pages and assets, like they are localized in a different way. So all the exceptions, the workflows for content authors, and so on. So yeah, it's really just being rigorous about documenting it and updating the documentation if your project changes.
Hard to explain it to content editors how this works? Like, do you need to like brief them on the process, or do you just let them follow hard guidelines you give them and hope they don't deviate?
So yeah, so we do write documentation specifically for content authors. So it's really important to use the proper terminology and keep it very, very simple with screenshots and basically flowcharts, I would say, like very simplified ones. But yes, it is challenging sometimes to basically explain the concept. But yeah, it's important to distinguish between like content author concepts and technical concepts. Like content authors do not need to know like everything that's happening in the background, but certainly they need to be aware like what is a locale, why there are multiple locales on a single page, and so on. But so far, my experience was that there is documentation needed for content authors. There is some onboarding process, but usually it works pretty well.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, so all of you are translating and localization experts. No more questions. Okay? Yeah.
I can get one question.
Yeah, here. You get the microphone?
Longer maybe?
Fine.
Good.
Hi, I have a question. I have a use case. You have a localized page, and many relation to localized data objects. And you have sort column on many extra fields, and then the client wants to have different sort order on each locale. Do you have any solution for that problem?
So yes, there is a solution for that. So you can create, instead of many relation, you can create a many through relationship. So that's essentially very similar, but the relationship has like a model that represents like the relationship, and you can customize that model, and that model can be localized as well. So basically the solution is to switch to many through and localize your relationship model.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Always.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I think we're all very experienced in Fluent.
All right. Thank you, Mojmir. Very interesting. Thanks very much.
No worries.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Good applause.